Okay, I want you to picture something for a second. You are pushing this massive, jagged boulder up a ridiculously steep hill. Your muscles are absolutely burning, you're completely exhausted, and for every foot you manage to gain, you slip back too. It's brutal. Now, imagine just stepping off that hill, walking over to a nearby river, hopping onto a raft, and simply letting the current effortlessly carry you downstream. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are exploring why that river raft might actually be the ultimate strategy for navigating life and, surprisingly, finding success. So let's dive right into this. What if giving up control is actually the secret to gaining it? I know, it sounds entirely backward to literally everything we're taught about ambition, hustle culture, and, making things happen, right? But this brings us to what we call the control paradox. It's this profound idea that trying too hard, forcing outcomes, and gripping the steering wheel so tightly your knuckles turn white, well, it often yields far less progress than simply stepping aside. And this concept maps perfectly onto our modern pop culture. We have a perspective here we love to call Papa's Take. This is an insight from a grandfather who was watching a beloved Disney movie with his granddaughter. He pointed out that in Disney's Frozen, the Snow Queen Elsa spends years completely exhausted from suppressing who she really is. It's only when she finally stops fighting her innate power and literally sings "Let It Go" that she discovers a massive truth. Acceptance creates what resistance never could. She gains her ultimate power entirely by releasing her need to control it. That right there brilliantly illustrates the exhaustion of force. Think about it. When you try to force a river to flow backward, you don't change the river, you just drown yourself in the effort. It's actually a fascinating piece of trivia that during the initial story development of Frozen, Elsa was written as the villain. It was only when the songwriters composed Let It Go from this deeply emotional, vulnerable place that the creators realized, wait, Elsa isn't evil at all. She was just exhausting herself fighting her true nature. The absolute minute she let go, the entire story shifted in her favor. Now, this exact philosophy wasn't just born out of modern pop culture. It was actually forged in the fires of an incredibly tumultuous time. We're going to travel back to 6th century BC China, right into the middle of the Warring States era. And it was exactly as it sounds, a totally chaotic period of intense violence and political upheaval. Rulers across the land were desperately trying to maintain order. They relied on harsh laws, military might, and this exhausting, rigid control just to govern their people. It was quite literally an era defined by pushing the boulder uphill. Enter Lao Tzu. His name translates to Old Master, and he was a legendary philosopher and a royal archivist for the Zhou court. Tradition tells us that Lao Tzu was just utterly weary of the moral decay and the endless, frantic striving of his era. So he decided to leave society entirely and retire into the Western wilderness. But the legend goes that before he crossed the border, a guard asked him to write down his wisdom. And in a single session, Lao Tzu supposedly composed the Tao Te Ching, which went on to become the foundational text of Taoism. The really crucial point here is found in chapter 48 of that text. Lao Tzu writes that pursuing ordinary learning means adding something to yourself every single day. But pursuing the Tao, the natural way of the universe, means diminishing your doing every day. Now, the text frames this not as laziness, so don't go canceling your plans just yet, but as a highly disciplined alternative to raw, exhausting ambition. It's an evolving wisdom tradition that actively asks us to subtract rather than constantly accumulate. Which brings us to the absolute core concept of this entire explainer, Wu Wei. Now, it's often literally translated as non-action or doing nothing, but honestly, that's a massive misconception. It absolutely does not mean sitting on the couch being passive. A much better translation is effortless action or unselfconscious action. It is perfect action in harmony with the natural order, completely free of your individual ego, forcing, or contriving. It is that exact magical moment when the raft catches the current. Let's compare these two mindsets directly, because it's super revealing. On one hand, we have accumulating. This is our default modern setting, right? We add tasks, we acquire facts, we build up our egos, and we try to impose our will on the world. But on the other hand, we have subtracting, the path of the Tao. This means dropping a compulsion to control every single day. It's letting go of a rigid ambition or stripping away a piece of the ego. By subtracting, you are actively removing the friction between yourself and reality. And what's really amazing is that modern science completely backs this ancient idea up. Today, psychologists and sports researchers study something called the flow state. Whether you're an elite athlete on the field, a musician on stage, or a software programmer deep in code, peak performance happens when your action and your awareness fuse seamlessly together. You aren't overthinking every step, you aren't trying to force the outcome. You're highly skilled, sure, but you're acting entirely without self-consciousness. Flow is essentially the modern psychological equivalent of Wu Wei. Think about it like being caught in an ocean riptide. If you panic and try to swim directly against the current, straight back to the beach, what happens? Well, you exhaust yourself, you make zero progress, and you seriously risk drowning. But if you practice Wu Wei, if you accept the reality of the water's massive momentum, you simply float. You conserve your energy, and you swim parallel to the shore. By not fighting the force, you survive, and you eventually reach the sand. There's this incredibly striking 1955 translation of Lao Tzu's text by a guy named Raymond Blackney, and it just beautifully captures this whole vibe. He wrote, "By letting it go, it all gets done. The world is won by those who let it go." I mean, wow. It illustrates that quiet discipline perfectly. When you finally release your desperate grip on how you think things must be, you actually allow the world to turn on its own immense momentum, and suddenly you're moving with it rather than being crushed by it. So why does this matter, and what should you actually take away from this? Here's how we apply this ancient wisdom to our very busy modern lives. First, stop trying to overpower your circumstances. If the boulder won't budge, stop pushing it. Second, try subtracting daily. Just drop one need to control an outcome today. Third, recognize that you aren't separate from nature. You're a part of it. When you actively practice stepping back from that heavy self-consciousness, you begin to allow the current to carry the weight. You let the systems around you do the work. And this brings us to a final Papa-inspired closing thought. Progress rarely comes from frantic force. Whether it's a 6th century philosopher navigating a chaotic warring empire or a Disney queen standing alone on an icy mountain, the ultimate realization is exactly the same. True mastery comes from learning to go with the flow of nature, realizing you don't have to force the universe to spin, and simply letting things be. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. Take a second and think about the biggest challenge you are facing right now, whether that's at work or in your personal life. Will you spend tomorrow pushing that boulder uphill until you're completely exhausted, or will you finally step aside, find the river, and let it go?